Okay, before I forget, I want to go back into the history, but very quickly, let me cover the things I've got on the bottom of the panel here. One of the interesting aspects you see in East Asia, and this is also largely true of much of Southeast Asia, is that one of your major religious systems, Buddhism, that comes in about 2,000 years ago, has as one of its basic principles the idea that other religions actually are legit. You have to remember, most major world religions are universalistic, and they're also monopolistic. So, for example, if you're Catholic, there's not an attitude that Islam is an equally good religion. There's a very strong attitude in all the universalistic, sort of monopolistic religions that they have the only true word, and therefore one of the jobs you have if you're part of that religion is to convert people that are misguided and being part of other religions to and take your religion. That's why this campus, Chaminade, is a Marianist campus, and it's part of the Marianist missionizing of Catholicism. In this case, more through example than actually pounding on doors. And that's why we're a little different than, say, BYUH, which is a Church of Latter-day Saints missionizing campus. So in that concept, what's interesting about most of the forms of Buddhism, there are a few exceptions, is that they see other religions as being equally valid ways to achieve sort of self-discovery, the idea of nirvana. And so they don't see themselves as having an exclusive word. They see themselves as having the best word, but they also see that other religions can be equally valuable for individuals, et cetera, et cetera. What this means when Buddhism especially moves into East Asia, because Buddhism starts in northern India, when it moves into East Asia, the existing in-place sort of home religions, which is usually termed as Taoism in China and then Shinto in Japan, and the Koreans sort of have a mix of the two, closer to Shinto. So what you find is when the new religion comes in, it doesn't try to get rid of the old religions. This is a radical difference to, say, Christianity moving into, say, Latin America, where you intentionally displace, especially at some point with the Inquisition, any trace of the old belief systems and replace it with Christianity. And so we call these types of religions syncretic in the sense that they actually are additive. For example, if you go to the Guanyin Temple in Vineyard Street, which is a Buddhist temple, inside about half of the images there and about half of the stuff that people do are actually Taoist. And this is very typical of most Buddhist temples. They have Taoist aspects to them. If you go to Japan, you'll find that almost all Buddhist temples excuse me, in Japan have Shinto in them in certain places or things. So there's not this idea that one religion has the only way or the only word. What you also then find is that because the traditional religions aren't getting banged on, is that their belief systems tend to be very powerful and very consistent. Though the interesting thing in most of East Asia, what you find is a lot of what people do, say at Chinese New Year's, or if you go to a Japanese temple, you buy things like good luck charms, like we put on the doors here for the Chinese one. Japanese, it might be the good luck charms that you see on phones or on people in backpacks and such like that. These are actually all part of the in-place religions, so Taoism in China, Shinto in Japan. And so what's happened, a lot of this is sort of morphed into the closest parallel I can think of in the United States would be the idea of good luck. So what you have, excuse me, is that Buddhism becomes the in-place religion for complicated things. But for many other things, especially things which are related to chance or luck, you find the in-place religion has done that. And so what happens is the religions become complementary. The traditional saying in Japan and actually most of China would be that you're born and you die Buddhist. But during your life, you're Shinto. And in China, during your life, much of what you do would be Taoist. So what you find then is that religions can be complementary. Religions don't have to be in direct competition with each other. And this is, something sad to say that we don't see in most of the world, because you don't find religious wars are not as common in East Asia just because you don't have this idea of, sort of my way is the only way of looking at stuff. Just as a note, what you also find in most of East Asia, and this is also true in Southeast Asia, is one of the aspects of Taoism is the idea the landscape actually has chi or life energy. We call it mana here in Hawaii. And so what you have is a whole intellectual, platform built on the idea of basic reading and understanding landscapes. And from that, basically then saying, like where you should build, where you should put a door, where you should put a business, with the idea that you actually tap or manipulate this chi or mana. We actually had the same thing here in Hawaii. There was a whole group of Tongas whose job was basically to do, the Hawaiian form of geomancy, which is the idea of placing things. I should point out that in Europe, you'll actually also find this in the Celtic tradition. Geomancy was a big thing. And in fact, in the Catholic tradition, up till about maybe 1100 AD, generally almost invariably churches and cathedrals especially are placed on a set of geomantic principles. After that, it just sort of, fades out in the Catholic tradition for whatever set of reasons. In Asia, what you also find then is there's another branch of this, which is the idea of Ming Shui. So feng shui is the idea of geomancy, or basically mana qi in the landscape. Ming Shui is the idea of mana or qi in numbers and time. So for example, in Asia, as I think I mentioned before, when you're born, there will frequently be, at least in China, this used to be true in Japan, you will actually have someone with a stopwatch, recording the minute that you're born. And this is because there's this very strong sense in almost all of Asia that the year you're born, the zodiac sign that the Chinese would have that fits that, the day and the minute you're born, actually shape your potential for your future. This is also true of numbers. So for example, depending on what day and year you're born, people would actually say the numbers that are attached to you would actually have some impact on you. Classically in China, if you want to see this, is if you go to like China Mobile or one of the other phone services and you buy a temporary SIM card, they'll actually have two books. There's a book that they use for foreigners, which is all the numbers that they don't like. So, like anything with foreign, which in China is just anathema. So like the equivalent of 13 in the US. Then there's actually a good book. So if you ask for the good book, the price is about 3 times higher for the chip as it is if you ask for the bad book, because the bad numbers they can't give away. Chinese won't touch a number that had like 4 in it, especially a business number, because that would be just guaranteed there's going to be a disaster. So, there's actually 2 books, and it's sort of fun if you go into a China Mobile shop and actually ask for the good book, and the clerks, especially if you're, if you're around or something like that, the clerks oftentimes sort of give you a look of shock. It's like, well, how would you know that? So this idea of numbers being an important part of stuff is actually also part of this form of again, traditional religious systems that have almost become so much part of popular belief. I don't think people think about them, but they certainly are the way that people operate. And the best would be the number 4 in much of Asia. You won't find, for example, hotels won't have a 4th floor. Houses will never have, if you go down the street, you won't find the number 4 in someone's house. Or if you did, it'd be a foreigner living in it. So, it's sort of similar to the number 13 in the West, but it has a more logical, structured basis to it in Asia. Okay, so to finish up on the sort of perceptual stuff. When you look at Asia, you have to remember that I mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, there's a very strong sense that cities are where everything happens. Rural areas are for, just put it really bluntly, for losers. And this is why when you look at Asia, you tend to find, enormously compressed areas. This is a picture of Xi'an from about 5 years ago. The key here is that Xi'an is in the middle of a flat area, so you could expand the city out in any direction. In the United States, you would. But in Asia, because being in the city is key, you just literally have massive high rises. Some of these are, this is pretty old, it's probably about maybe 20, 30 years ago. But some of these are pretty much brand new. There's a whole mess going on, brand new ones going in. And so what you get is the idea of living in the urban area is absolutely central to success, economic success, educational success, access to medical services, access to stuff. Everything is tied to the urban center. And so anywhere in Asia, this is also true in Southeast Asia, if you want to get ahead, you head to the city. And then cities are ranked. So you not only head to a city, but if you're in good luck, you head to a bigger city or to the best city. So, if you're in say Wuhan, for example, you might head to one of the cities there. If you want to be more successful, you head to Guangzhou. And if you want to be really successful, you head to Shanghai or Beijing or Xi'an. And so, what you get is this enormous pressure of people moving to the city almost in desperation, because if they want to be upwardly mobile in any way, shape, or form, you only do that in the urban centers. And so what you find in the rural areas, and this is probably most striking in Japan, but it's found all throughout East Asia, is the rural areas tend to have older folks, and they tend to have little kids, because in many cases, the adults, the younger adults, will move to the city, leave their kids with their parents or grandparents, move to the city, try to make ends meet, get together, and then when they finally, make some success in themselves, if they do, then they ship the kids and their grandparents or something into the city with them. So what you end up is sort of this ball of string, phenomena of migration to the urban centers. But the main thing from a perceptual standpoint is being in a large city doesn't bother people. Being in a tall building like these doesn't bother people. They don't have the idea of a single family home. In the rural areas, they generally have their own homes. But in the urban centers, being in the city is so important. You don't care if you live in a crappy little closet. The key thing is being in the city gives you a chance and a potential for success. Being in the country, and if you've got a 20-room house, you're still a failure. And this has enormous pressures on the governments because, to a certain extent, if everyone leaves the countryside, then you don't have any farmers anymore. So, and you also end up with this enormous overpopulation in the cities where they grow just crazy, incredibly quickly. So the government's not necessarily in favor of this, but it's literally thousands of years of sort of attitude and value. And then the governments try every once in a while, sort of half-heartedly, to get people to, stay in the countryside and, develop the countryside or smaller towns. So there's no idea of like the small town or, the middle-sized town or even a small city in Asia is generally a place of failure or limited advancement. Only the large cities are where you're actually going to get ahead. And of course, then it's being a self-fulfilling prophecy because everyone who's ambitious and wants to get ahead goes to the big cities. And so the folks that are more comfortable with, status quo and stuff stay in the small towns. That reinforces the attitude, but it's been there for thousands of years. If you remember that when I was showing you the pictures earlier, the wall around Xi'an, if you want to, there's actually a mental wall around cities that's even bigger than those physical walls. And these have a huge, impact on, for example, almost all your urban centers in the world. A few of them are in South Asia, in India specifically, but almost all your other major urban centers are in East Asia. Xi'an's a good example. Xi'an had only 4 million people about 25 years ago. Now it's up to somewhere between 10 and 14 million, depending on who's counting. You think about that's an enormous increase in population in an incredibly short period of time. And that's just one city. It's a successful city and it's a very important city, but nonetheless, it's not the only one. Shanghai has just grown so large that no one even knows how large Shanghai is, including the authorities. So, it's this type of crazy growth is very typical in East Asia. Korea is probably the most striking in this regard, between Busan and Seoul being sort of the only acceptable cities in some ways. But this is an East Asian mentality thing, and it's a cultural thing. So it's an important aspect of urbanization in East Asia. It's a constantly ongoing, growing phenomenon. It's not something that's temporary or recent.